A fatal mistake. Have you ever paused to consider the fragility of fate, the way a single decision, made in the blink of an eye, can irrevocably alter the course of a life? Tonight, on this desolate stretch of asphalt, a police officer is about to commit a blunder of catastrophic proportions, an error that will not only shatter his career but will also expose a raw and festering truth about prejudice and the intoxicating nature of unchecked authority. Join us as we delve into this gripping narrative and witness the unfolding drama when the line separating the enforcer of justice from the abuser of power becomes dangerously blurred. What happens when the very person sworn to uphold the law becomes its most egregious violator? All because of a deeply ingrained bias. Keep watching to find out. Behind the wheel of a marked police cruiser sat Officer Ryan Carter, a white man in his late 30s with a sharply defined jawline and eyes that habitually scanned his surroundings with a mixture of vigilance and suspicion. Years on the force had etched lines of cynicism around his eyes, and tonight, that cynicism was particularly sharp. He knew this part of town, or at least he thought he did. He operated under a set of unwritten rules, assumptions whispered in the locker room and ingrained through countless shifts. One of those rules, unspoken but potent, flickered in his mind as he watched the black sedan approach in his rearview mirror. Expensive car, black driver, late at night, probable cause for a closer look at the very least. Without a second thought, Ryan flicked on his flashing blue and red lights, their sudden, jarring brilliance slicing through the nocturnal calm. The black sedan smoothly pulled over to the side of the road, its brake lights glowing a brief, intense red before dimming. The driver's side window lowered, revealing the occupant, Samuel Johnson, a middle-aged black man dressed in a tailored suit, his expression calm and composed despite the flashing lights illuminating his face. His neatly trimmed salt and pepper hair and the subtle glint of a gold watch on his wrist spoke of a quiet success, a life meticulously built. Ryan exited his cruiser, his posture radiating an air of authority bordering on arrogance. He approached the sedan with a measured stride, his hand instinctively resting on the butt of his holstered firearm. He offered no greeting, no polite request for license and registration. Instead, he shone his high-powered flashlight directly into Samuel's face, the harsh beam momentarily blinding the man. Ryan's eyes, narrowed with suspicion, darted from Samuel's face to the interior of the car, searching for any sign of wrongdoing, any justification for the unease that had settled in his gut. His tone was accusatory, devoid of any semblance of courtesy. "Where do you think you're going at this hour? Is this your vehicle? Let me see your identification and registration." His voice was deep and steady, betraying no hint of the surprise or annoyance he must have felt. "Officer, I am on my way home. Yes, this is my car. My driver's license and registration are in the glove compartment. May I retrieve them?" Ryan didn't respond immediately. In the brief silence that followed, his mind raced, constructing a narrative based on ingrained biases and past experiences. This man could be involved in drug trafficking. He might be armed. It was better to be proactive, to take control of the situation before it escalated. The thought solidified into a conviction. This was not a routine traffic stop. This was a potential threat. His hand tightened on his weapon. Without warning, he drew his service pistol, the metallic click echoing in the stillness of the night. He leveled the firearm at Samuel, his voice rising in a sharp, commanding shout. His voice was laced with adrenaline and a false sense of danger. "Put your hands on the steering wheel. Right now. Do not move." Samuel recoiled slightly, his eyes widening in shock and disbelief. He raised his hands slowly, deliberately, placing them on the steering wheel as instructed. He tried to maintain his composure, his voice calm despite the tremor of fear that ran through him. His voice was measured, attempting to de-escalate the situation. "Officer, I am simply trying to explain." Ryan cut him off, his patience already exhausted. He lunged forward, reaching through the open window and roughly grabbing Samuel by the collar of his expensive suit jacket. He yanked the older man out of the car with surprising force. Samuel stumbled, his feet catching on the curb. Before he could regain his balance, Ryan delivered a sharp, brutal punch to his abdomen. The air rushed out of Samuel's lungs, and he doubled over in pain, a groan escaping his lips. But Ryan wasn't finished. Fueled by a misguided sense of authority and the adrenaline coursing through his veins, he shoved Samuel down onto the cold, unforgiving asphalt. He pressed his knee into the man's back, ignoring the muffled protests. Roughly, he twisted Samuel's arm behind him, snapping the handcuffs into place. In the dim light of the street lamp, Ryan's eyes gleamed with a disturbing mix of aggression and a grim satisfaction. He felt in control, in charge. This was how things were done in this part of town, or so he believed. "Samuel." His voice was strained, each word punctuated by ragged breaths. "I haven't done anything wrong. Please just take a closer look at me." But Ryan wasn't listening. He had conducted countless checks like this before, and in his mind, Samuel Johnson was just another statistic, another potential criminal fitting a preconceived profile. The man's pleas fell on deaf ears. With a final, forceful shove, Ryan hauled Samuel to his feet, ignoring the older man's wince of pain. He roughly guided him towards the back of the police cruiser, pushing him into the cramped back seat. The cold plastic of the seat and the metallic tang of the handcuffs biting into his wrists were a stark contrast to the plush leather of his own car. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing in the night, sealing Samuel's fate for the immediate future. Ryan climbed back into the driver's seat, his heart still pounding with the rush of the encounter. He started the engine, the roar momentarily drowning out the quiet sobs emanating from the back seat. Without another glance at the man he had just apprehended, Ryan Carter put the cruiser into drive and sped away, leaving the deserted street and the lingering scent of injustice behind. His destination. The precinct, where the consequences of his actions were about to unfold in a way he could never have imagined. The tables turn. The cold interrogation room. The fluorescent lights of the precinct buzzed with a monotonous hum, casting a stark, unflattering glow on the linoleum floors and the tired faces of the few officers still on duty in the late hours. The air was thick with the stale scent of coffee and the lingering tension that seemed to perpetually hang over the building. Ryan Carter, his adrenaline slowly receding, roughly steered Samuel Johnson through the maze of desks and corridors. Samuel, his hands cuffed behind his back, moved with a surprising dignity despite his disheveled appearance and the lingering ache in his abdomen. They reached a small, windowless room designated for interrogations. The walls were painted a drab, institutional green, and the only furniture consisted of a metal table bolted to the floor and two uncomfortable-looking metal chairs. Ryan shoved Samuel into one of the chairs, the clanging of the handcuffs against the metal echoing in the confined space. He then positioned himself in the opposite chair, his posture still radiating a misplaced sense of authority. He tossed a manila file folder onto the table with a loud thud, the sound intended to intimidate. His voice was still sharp, though slightly less aggressive than on the street. "Name." And what exactly were you doing in that neighborhood at this hour? Samuel sat upright, his gaze steady despite the harsh lighting. He took a slow, deliberate breath, the events of the past few minutes replaying in his mind. He felt a pang of disappointment, not just for himself, but for the system he had dedicated his life to serving. He looked directly at Ryan, his expression a mixture of weariness and a quiet knowing. His voice was calm and even, with a hint of something Ryan couldn't quite place. As I said on the street, Officer Carter, my name is Samuel Johnson, and I was on my way home. Ryan scoffed, leaning back in his chair with an air of disbelief. Home? In that kind of car? At that hour? Come on, let's cut the crap. We both know what's really going on here. Samuel simply regarded him with a level gaze, offering no further explanation. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the hum of the lights. Ryan's frustration grew. He reached over and snatched Samuel's wallet from his back pocket. Flipping it open, he examined the driver's license, his eyes scanning the information. Samuel Johnson, occupation, listed as city official? He raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing on his lips. Real funny. What's your real job, pal? That is my real occupation, Officer Carter. Ryan tossed the wallet back onto the table dismissively. He wasn't buying it. He stood up and paced the small room, his agitation evident in his movements. Look, I've been doing this a long time. I know a suspicious situation when I see one. A guy like you driving a fancy car in that neighborhood at this time of night. It doesn't add up. Samuel watched him silently, his expression unreadable. Ryan stopped pacing and leaned over the table, his face close to Samuel's. So, let's try this again. What were you really doing there? Samuel sighed softly, a hint of resignation in his voice. Officer, I assure you, I was simply driving home from a late meeting. Ryan rolled his eyes. He turned to a uniformed officer sitting at a nearby desk, a young man named Officer Jones who had been quietly observing the situation. Jones, run a background check on this guy. Samuel Johnson. Let's see what comes up. Jones nodded and began typing on his computer. The rhythmic tapping of the keys filled the silence of the precinct. Ryan continued to glare at Samuel, his arms crossed over his chest. He felt a sense of righteous indignation. He had done his job, he had identified a potential threat, and this guy was just being uncooperative. Moments stretched into an eternity. The only sound was the persistent hum of the lights and the clicking of Jones's keyboard. Then suddenly the typing stopped. Jones's fingers froze above the keys. His face, which had been neutral just moments before, now registered a look of utter shock and disbelief. His eyes were wide, fixed on the screen in front of him. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. His voice was barely a whisper, filled with stunned disbelief. Ryan turned, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. What is it, Jones? Find something interesting? Jones didn't answer immediately. He seemed unable to take his eyes off the screen. He stammered, his voice trembling slightly. Ryan, you just arrested the new police chief. The words hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. Ryan felt as if he had been physically struck. The blood drained from his face, leaving him pale and clammy. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights seemed to intensify, the silence in the room suddenly deafening. His mind struggled to process the information. The new police chief, the man he had just manhandled on the street, couldn't be true. There had to be some mistake. Meanwhile, Samuel Johnson, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. He looked directly into Ryan's eyes, a subtle, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. His voice was calm and steady, but now carried a weight of authority that was unmistakable. "Now, Officer Carter, do you recognize who I am?" The revelation sent shockwaves through the precinct. The initial quiet hum of the late night was shattered by a palpable wave of disbelief and nervous energy. Whispers rippled through the corridors as the news spread like wildfire. Officer Ryan Carter had just arrested the new chief of police. The atmosphere in the interrogation room shifted dramatically. The air, which had been thick with Ryan's suspicion and Samuel's quiet defiance, now crackled with an almost unbearable tension. Ryan stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape, his mind reeling from the unexpected turn of events. He stared at Samuel, trying to reconcile the composed man sitting before him with the image of the suspect he had wrestled to the ground just minutes ago. Other officers, who had been casually observing the arrest from a distance, now exchanged stunned glances. Some rushed over to Jones's desk, their eyes glued to the computer screen, confirming the unbelievable truth. A low murmur of disbelief and apprehension filled the precinct. Suddenly, the door to the interrogation room burst open, and Captain Owens stormed in. His face, usually a picture of calm authority, was now flushed with anger and disbelief. His eyes, blazing with fury, were fixed on Ryan. His voice was a thunderous roar that echoed through the precinct. "Carter, what in God's name have you done? You assaulted the new chief of police on his very first night. Do you have any idea the gravity of what you've just done?" Ryan stammered, his tongue feeling thick and unwieldy in his mouth. He tried to form words, to offer some kind of explanation, but all that came out was a jumbled mess of incoherent sounds. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him as the reality of his actions crashed down upon him. Samuel Johnson, still handcuffed, slowly rose from his chair. He stretched his shoulders, a slight grimace of discomfort crossing his face, and then carefully straightened his wrinkled suit jacket. He looked directly at Captain Owens, his expression calm but firm. His voice, though measured, held an undeniable air of command. "Captain Owens, I presume? While I appreciate your concern, I believe this situation requires a more formal approach. Perhaps we should discuss this in your office." Samuel's calm demeanor in the face of such a monumental blunder only served to amplify the gravity of the situation. The other officers watched in stunned silence as the new chief, the man they were supposed to respect and obey, stood before them, a victim of blatant prejudice and abuse of power at the hands of one of their own. Captain Owens, his face still red with anger and embarrassment, could only nod dumbly. He understood the implications of this incident. It wasn't just a matter of a rogue officer making a mistake. It was a reflection of deeper, more systemic issues within the police force. The news of this incident would undoubtedly spread like wildfire, damaging the department's reputation and further eroding public trust. He knew he had to act swiftly and decisively to contain the damage. The tables had indeed turned, and the consequences for Ryan Carter, and perhaps for the entire precinct, were about to be severe. 10 agonizing minutes crawled by, each tick of the clock in Captain Owens's office amplifying the weight of Ryan Carter's monumental blunder. The once familiar scent of stale coffee and official paperwork now felt suffocating, a stark reminder of the career that was crumbling before his very eyes. The symbol of his authority, the badge he had worn with a sense of pride, lay heavy and cold in his trembling hand. The power he had wielded just hours ago had evaporated, slipping through his fingers like grains of sand. Samuel Johnson stood opposite Ryan, his arms crossed, his gaze unwavering. The initial shock and anger in his eyes had been replaced by a look of profound disappointment and a quiet resolve. Captain Owens, his face still etched with a mixture of fury and embarrassment, paced nervously behind his desk, the polished surface reflecting his agitated movements. His voice was calm, but with an underlying steel that Ryan had not detected earlier. "You are accustomed to giving orders, Officer Carter. But today you will learn what it is like to receive them." Captain Owens stopped pacing, his gaze locking onto Ryan. His voice was low and gravelly, filled with a bitter disappointment. "Carter, your badge and your weapon. Now." Ryan's fingers fumbled with the pin of his badge. The gold felt heavy, almost accusatory in his palm. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his shattered career, he placed the badge on the captain's desk. The metallic click as it landed echoed the finality of the moment. He then unholstered his service weapon, the cold steel a stark contrast to the sweat that slicked his hand. He laid it beside the badge, his eyes downcast, unable to meet the gaze of either Samuel or Captain Owens. He knew with a chilling certainty that there was no coming back from this. He had crossed a line, and the consequences were irreversible. The following morning, the news of the incident exploded across every media outlet. Television screens flashed images of the police cruiser, the street where the traffic stop had occurred, and even a grainy photograph of Ryan Carter from his academy days. Breaking news this morning. A rogue police officer has been immediately terminated from his duties following a shocking incident last night. Officer Ryan Carter, a 5-year veteran of the force, is accused of assaulting the newly appointed police chief, Samuel Johnson, during what is being described as a racially biased traffic stop. Sources within the police department confirm that Chief Johnson was pulled over without cause and subjected to unnecessary force just hours after assuming his new role. The internet erupted with a firestorm of opinions. Social media platforms became battlegrounds for heated debates. Some users expressed outrage at Ryan's actions, calling for his immediate prosecution and demanding systemic reform within the police department. They cited the incident as further proof of the racial profiling and abuse of power that plagued law enforcement. Others, however, rushed to Ryan's defense, portraying him as a dedicated officer who had simply made a mistake, a victim of circumstance, caught in an unfortunate situation. The hashtag Justice for Carter began to trend alongside calls for accountability. Meanwhile, in his new office, a spacious room overlooking the sprawling cityscape, Samuel Johnson stood by the window, the morning sun casting long shadows across the polished floor. He held a steaming mug of coffee, the warmth a small comfort against the chill that still lingered from the previous night's encounter. A senior officer, a woman with a distinguished career and a reputation for fairness, knocked softly on the open door and entered. "Chief Johnson, there's a formal petition circulating, requesting the reinstatement of Officer Ryan Carter. The union is involved, and there's considerable pressure from some quarters. What are your instructions on how to proceed?" Samuel turned from the window, his gaze thoughtful. He took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes reflecting the complexity of the situation. He considered the various arguments, the potential for further division within the community, and the message that his decision would send. He thought about the fear he had felt during the traffic stop, the humiliation of being handcuffed and thrown to the ground, and the chilling realization of how easily power could be abused. but he also considered the potential for growth and change. His voice was measured, each word carefully chosen. Let him learn what it means to be a citizen first. Let him experience the system from the other side, without the shield of his badge and the authority it represents. Only then, perhaps, will he truly understand the impact of his actions. We will review his case in due course, but for now his termination stands. Samuel turned back to the window, his gaze fixed on the city below. There was no triumph in his expression, no hint of vindictiveness. Instead, his eyes held a deep sense of responsibility and a quiet determination to effect meaningful change. This was not merely about punishing a rogue officer. It was about sending a clear message that prejudice and abuse of power would not be tolerated within his department. It was a lesson, not just for Ryan Carter, but for an entire system that needed to confront its own biases and work towards building trust and accountability within the community it served. The chess pieces had indeed fallen, and the landscape of the police department, and perhaps the city itself, would never be quite the same. This story serves as a stark and unsettling reminder of the insidious nature of prejudice and the profound consequences of unchecked authority. It lays bare the human cost of bias, not only for the victim of injustice but also for the perpetrator and the very institutions they represent. It compels us to confront uncomfortable truths about the power dynamics that shape our society and the ingrained assumptions that can lead to devastating errors in judgment. At its core, this narrative underscores the vital importance of empathy and understanding. It highlights the necessity for those in positions of power to exercise their authority with humility, fairness, and a deep respect for the rights and dignity of every individual, regardless of their background or appearance. The badge and the uniform should represent service and protection, not a license to discriminate or abuse. As a storyteller, I believe that every narrative holds a mirror up to society, reflecting both its strengths and its flaws. The reflection in this particular story is a sobering one, urging us to examine our own biases and to actively work towards creating a more just and equitable world for all. It reminds us that appearances can be deceiving and that true character lies not in outward markers, but in the content of one's heart and the integrity of one's actions. The philosophical undercurrent of this tale resonates with the timeless wisdom of figures like Martin Luther King Jr., who eloquently stated, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Samuel Johnson's measured response, his focus on education and systemic change rather than immediate retribution, echoes the sentiment that true progress lies in understanding and reform, not simply in punishment. As the ancient proverb wisely cautions, "Before you judge a man, walk a mile in his shoes." Ryan Carter's fatal mistake was his failure to see Samuel Johnson as anything more than a stereotype, a failure that ultimately led to his own downfall. Thank you for joining me on this journey into a night of fateful decisions and unexpected consequences. If this story has resonated with you, if it has sparked a thought or ignited a feeling, please take a moment to share it with others. Let's continue the conversation about the importance of equality, justice, and the need to challenge our own preconceived notions. Your engagement helps to amplify these crucial messages and contributes to a more informed and compassionate society. And if you are eager to explore more compelling narratives that delve into the complexities of the human experience, be sure to check out the other videos on this channel. We offer a diverse range of stories designed to entertain, provoke thought, and perhaps even inspire change. Click on the suggested video next, or browse our library for more captivating tales. Your support allows us to continue bringing these stories to life. Until next time, thank you for watching, and remember that every story, no matter how small, has the power to make a difference.